Bedford.
Welcome to the Viking Science Academy. Today we're going to be talking about cells. Cells are really small, super small.
Yes, they are.
They're the smallest unit of life that we have. We've been talking about atoms and molecules, and when you put a lot of those molecules together, that's when you start having some cells. We break cells into two different groups. Unicellular, those are organisms that are made of just one single cell, and then multicellular, like us. We have countless numbers of cells. What about the first guy?
Hey, Robert Hooke. He's the first guy to actually. I think people were seeing them at the time, but and with the advent of the microscope and those kinds of things, he looked at cork cells, and he saw that there were these little boxes, and so he likened them to a prison cell.
Yeah.
So that's what I call cells.
Cells.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
So since then, scientists have kind of agreed on three theories that apply to all cells. If you want to be alive, you have to be made of cells. They are the basic building unit of all living things, and cells can only be made from other cells. We may see that third one change over time, but right now, that's the
true.
cell theory.
So cell diversity, we have different sizes, shapes, and organization within cells. So are all cells kind of the same size?
They're not. We kind of think of all cells as like super tiny, and they are small, but cells can be super long. For example, like a muscle cell in a giraffe's leg, it's over a yard long. Now, it's really, really skinny, but they're not all really, really tiny. Cells in a watermelon are quite large. Everything around one of those seeds is a cell, and a whole egg is actually one cell. Yeah.
So that leads to the three-dimensional. We talked about how atoms bond and they make the different molecules, and they are not linear, so they are three-dimensional, and so are cells.
Yeah. A lot of times you look in books and cells seem really flat. Remember, they're 3D. And kids always ask me in class, can a cell be the size of like our classroom? And the answer to that is no. And we have volume versus surface constraints. There's a lot of stuff that has to happen on the outside of the cell to keep it in balance. And at a certain point, there's kind of a breaking point where a cell cannot really get any bigger because the inside cannot be supported by the area on the outside.
Yeah. So they're organized. They're made up of things called organelles. I call them the cell's organs. Okay, the little structures that are inside. So we're going to take a look at those in a few slides, I think.
Okay. And then some of them don't have organs or nucleus, do they? And so
much,
we have two other groups. We have eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. And which one came first?
The prokaryotes.
Okay, prokaryotes are kind of the beginning of life, right?
Yep.
And then they evolved into the eukaryotes. There's still a few prokaryotes around today, but most cells are eukaryotic, and big living things like us. So what's the difference between the two of them?
Well, if you can see the structures are a little bit different. The eukaryotes are much more complex. They have way more of those cell organelles, the organs in them. They have a nucleus, okay, and that's where their DNA is found. And the prokaryotes, like a bacteria cell, for example, they're very basic. The DNA is not constricted in a nuclear membrane, and they're just
simple cells.
Simple cells.
Okay, they do simple jobs, and the eukaryotes do a lot more complex. Well, most cells do have a cell membrane, which is the outer covering of the cell. And I tell my classes that the cell membrane acts kind of like a bouncer at a club. It's like this big old bouncer at the door, and it's like, hey, you can come in. No, you're not getting in here. And that's called selectively permeable or semi-permeable. And we just learned about lipids and how they're not soluble with water. They don't like water. Well, here's a good example of those lipids. We've got the lipid that has the hydrophobic and hydrophilic parts to it. It's going to line itself up away, and we're going to make a barrier that holds some fluids in and some fluids outside of the cell.
Then cytoplasm, it's basically the jelly-like substance that's inside. It's mainly made of water. Also has all of the different ionic salts and stuff in it. And that's how the organelles can get through and do their jobs.
And then the last thing that most cells have is DNA, the genetic code. It tells the cells what kind of cell to be and what to do. So those are the three things that most cells have. So let's talk about some organelles. How about ribosomes? What do ribosomes do?
Hey, they make those proteins that we learned about a couple weeks ago. So
proteins build all kinds of other cells, right? Okay. So the endoplasmic reticulum is basically, I call it like the transportation highway. If you look at the picture here, it's got a lot of ridges and bumps, and the ribosomes stick to this endoplasmic reticulum and move their way around, and it helps transfer energy from one portion of the cell to another. And we can have rough ER or smooth ER. Rough ER has ribosomes on it, and smooth ER doesn't.
It's not. So the Golgi apparatus. Okay, I like these names are kind of funny, aren't they?
They are fun.
So these process and package substances that get ready to ship them out to different parts of the cell. We have the mitochondria. So these are where cellular respiration takes place. This is where we get the energy. And they actually thought that the mitochondria might have actually been another cell, another organism that was found its way into our eukaryotic cells. Symbiotic relationship.
Right.
So
I like to call the mitochondria the powerhouse of the cell.
Yep.
Like muscle cells in your human body have multi-mitochondria because they have to have so much energy. The mitochondria are there to make sure that they get that energy done. Lysosomes are my favorite one to say, lysosomes. They're the stomachs of the cell. Just like you start to wear out, parts wear out. Well, parts wear out inside of the cell too. They can't just sit there. They got to be replaced. And if you just keep replacing them, that cell just keeps getting bigger. So you got to actually kill them off. The lysosome digests old organelles. So when organelle's not doing its job anymore and a new one's been made, the lysosome's going to come over, it's going to digest it, and basically it's a garbage truck of the cell. It cleans stuff up.
Yeah. Microtubules, these are basically what gives the structure. So if you want to look at like a house and how it's built, it'd be kind of the studs to the house, the support to it.
Okay, it pushes it 3D, right?
Yep.
Okay. And then we have some cells that don't just stay in one place, they move around. So we've got cilia and flagella. Cilia are many small hair-like arms that are all working together. So it's kind of row, row, row. Mm-hmm. And then flagella is going to be one or more long tails that kind of whip back and forth to push it through. And we'll have a movie link under this so you guys can see some examples of that cilia and flagella. And then there comes the big dog, the nucleus. Yep. What's it about?
So the nucleus is, he's the boss. I mean, he's the control center of the cell. Stores all the code for the DNA. There's a nuclear membrane that's on the outside of it.
Kind of like its own cell membrane.
Yes, it is. Okay. It's where protein strands of DNA coil together, and this is where when we're getting there in a couple of weeks, but when we start to divide, this is where the chromosomes and everything start to show up. So
the beginning of a new cell starts here. Okay. Now, plant cells are a little bit different. Plant cells have three main differences between animal cells. And the first is that they don't have just a cell membrane. They also have a cell wall. And that's what makes a plant kind of rigid. You'll see in this picture here it's a lot thicker. It's created during growth in two different directions. And it's kind of what gives plants the woodiness or the fiberness tissue that makes a plant able to stand up on its own without any bones.
Yep.
That's the second difference.
The vacuoles, and this is just kind of extra storage space.
Reynoso, please stop by
Jonathan, show up.
Jonathan Reynoso.
And it's actually the largest part of the plant cell. So when we look at a plant cell, we'll look at a lot of these underneath the microscope. It's just extra fluids, extra nutrients for the cell.
All the organelles kind of get shoved over to the side
yeah,
in place for this large vacuole.
Yeah.
And lastly, plastids. Plant cells have to have a way to make food for themselves, and they do that through the process of photosynthesis. And they use plastids, which store the food and hold the pigments that help create the food. And so there's a couple of main types of plastids. Chloroplast is the one we'll focus on because it's the one that's responsible for photosynthesis. And then leucoplasts are what store carbon compounds. So those are the three main differences between a plant and animal cell. You should be able to tell us those differences and give us the basic descriptions and jobs of the different organelles in the cell.
Yep.
All right, guys, thanks for joining us on the Viking Science Academy, and we'll see you in class.
Were we there?
Yep, I gotta remember.
Excellent.